faced with the White House and Congress controlled by people who disparage and discredit long-standing democratic institutions and norms, we have witnessed an upsurge in civic engagement. People across the country are rising to defend our institutions and stand with communities that are being targeted by the administration's rhetoric and misogynistic, racist, and xenophobic base. Through their actions, people are already affirming what community organizers have long known. Communities, when organized, acting strategically and collaboratively, have the power to shape the decisions that impact all of our lives. So what will it take to build power to defend democracy, hold elected officials accountable, and transform the role of government? Why is local community organizing central to achieving long-term progressive power? And how is this moment of political consciousness awakening an opportunity to reconnect with our shared humanity in deeply meaningful ways? And how does organizing need to change to meet these demands? So it is my privilege and honor to introduce you to the panel. Our moderator will be Jonathan Smucker. Jonathan is the co-founder and director of Beyond the Choir. He has worked for 2 decades in grassroots movements for social, economic, and ecological justice as a grassroots organizer, campaigner, and strategist. He has trained thousands of change agents in campaign strategy, framing and messaging, direct action, and other skills. He also researches the collective action, identity, and politicization processes as the focus of his doctoral work in the sociology department at UC Berkeley. His writing has appeared in The Nation, The Huffington Post, Alternate, Waging Nonviolence, Yes Magazine, the Sociological Quarterly Berkeley Journal of Sociology, and he is the author of Hegemony How To, a roadmap for radicals. Zephyr Teachout is a law professor, author, and political activist. She will join this panel, of course, and her book, Corruption in America, explores the deep meaning of corruption in American history. She ran for governor of New York and Congress and is very involved in local rural organizing. She is currently working on a book about monopolies. Sabrina Smith, another panelist, is the Deputy Director for California Calls. She oversees program development, staff management, technology, infrastructure, and strategic communications. She's responsible for the day-to-day operations of the organization and stitches the program work together to enable the Alliance to mobilize a base of 500,000 new and occasional voters. Rashad Robinson. He is the executive director of ColorOfChange, the nation's largest online racial justice organization. As a force driven by over 1 million members, ColorOfChange moves decision makers in corporations and government to create a more human and less hostile world for Black people and all people. Rashad has developed winning strategies to change the rules of many, words not here properly, but of many, that'll work, affecting Black people's lives, employment and the economy, voting and politics, news and entertainment, and criminal justice. He has appeared in hundreds of media outlets, including ABC, CNN, MSNBC, BET, NPR, The New York Times, and Huffington Post. And he was a 2015 Ebony Magazine Power 100 honoree and on the Route 100 for the last 6 years. Fast Company named ColorOfChange the 6th most innovative company in the world in 2015, and the Stanford Social Innovation Review profiled its strategies for pursuing racial justice at internet speed in both online and in other venues. So please, please help me welcome this amazing panel to the stage.
Good morning. So, we're going to talk about power. Big word. I'm going to dig right into it, and I'm going to start by asking each of you your definition of power. But first, I want to read one of my favorite quotes from Dr. King about the subject. Power, properly understood, is nothing but the ability to achieve purpose. It is the strength required to bring about social, political, and economic change. And one of the great problems of history is that the concepts of love and power have usually been contrasted as opposites, polar opposites, so that love is identified with a resignation of power, and power with a denial of love. Now, we've got to get this thing right. What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. It is precisely this collision of immoral power with powerless morality which constitutes the major crisis of our times. So I know that the words of Dr. King are probably a hard act to follow, but Zephyr, you're up. How do you define power?
I'm not going to disagree with Dr. King. In fact, that was my email signature for about 2 years. I love that quote. I think it's really essential. And what I'm going to talk about briefly, and then we can have a fuller discussion, is where you started, or where that quote starts, where there's a lot of people on the left who bring enormous love to the table but have a complicated relationship towards power and are uncomfortable in particular with electoral power. I'll just tell you one story, but I spent a lot of time recruiting people to run for office, and this is a story I could tell you 1,000 times. I was talking to a 23-year-old Syracuse graduate who was really involved in local environmental justice, and there was a seat open, and I said, "You should run for office." And she's like, "I don't want to run for office." I said, "What do you want to do?" She said, "I want to join a local nonprofit." I said, "What will you do in that nonprofit?" She said, "Well, I'll go door to door. I'll raise money. I'll research facts. I'll talk to people. I'll give speeches." And I'm like, "Okay, so what's the difference between that and running for office? Are you worried that people are going to say nasty things about you on Facebook?" And she's like, "Oh, they already do." So I said, "Well, what's the difference? Is it because it's corrupt or because it's square?" And she's like, "Half corrupt, half square." I think we're in a moment where that's changing, but we do have now a 40-year history on the left of being really uncomfortable with the dirty compromises of electoral power. And there's a lot of different sources of power. When I run for office, I think about those sources of power all the time. But we have to be clear that your county legislature, your Congress, and your governor are all incredible sources of power. And if you care about people being able to breathe, eat, and educate themselves, then you've got to care about those formal sources of power. Now, one of the problems is that when we think about power, too often, and I mean we, Democrats and Republicans, get stuck with a few different kinds of power. You know, I think of power like the easiest way to think about sources of power is like if you have a teenager who won't do something, what are the different ways you can get that teenager to do something? And then think about a nation of 320 million teenagers. Well, you know, you've got fear is a source of power. Violence is a source of power. Money is a source of power. And we often stop with looking at fear, violence, and money as the sources of power. But there's so many other sources of power, and we have to draw on those sources of power because I got to tell you, the big corporations are always going to have more fear, money, and violence. They always are. So we have to draw on love, on community, on humor, on art, on knowledge, on joy. That's just the beginning. But thinking about like how the reluctant teenager is going to move from one place to another, there's so many different things we can draw on, and we've got to get out of fear, money, and violence as the only sources of power that we draw on. The last thing I want to say is, in running for office, it's really clear where power lies in this country. And right now, we are facing both the formal sources of power being taken over by well, I don't even want to describe him, but a cruel, bigoted, reckless, careless man, and then a really cowardly and selfish, greedy Congress. And that's not it. The other sources of power that we cannot forget while we take on Donald Trump and this Republican Congress are these major corporations, hedge funders, and the financial sector that are trying to govern us, really trying to take over. And I'm talking about Monsanto, I'm talking about JP Morgan, I'm talking about Walmart, Amazon, Facebook, Google, the big cable companies that are really trying to take over our government and govern us. And when you're running for office, you feel it. Like when I ran for governor, a real estate mogul gave my opponent, I ran for governor in the Democratic primary against Andrew Cuomo, who calls himself a Democrat. A real estate magnate gave him $1 million using different techniques. Andrew Cuomo outspent me about 60 to 1. When I was running for Congress, Robert Mercer, who you might know because he is a big donor behind Donald Trump, he gave $500,000 to support my opponent's campaign. And so one of the things that you feel when you're running for office these days is you aren't just running against your opponent, you are actually running against these big corporate powers. In fact, 2/3 of the money spent against me in the congressional race was not my opponent. It was super PAC money being spent. And then you also feel it when you're raising money. Like I am proud that in my congressional race, we had the highest percentage of low-dollar donors in the country. My donors gave less than Bernie Sanders on average, just $19. But I still did some traditional, on-the-phone fundraising. And in phone call after phone call, the sort of traditional big donors would say, oh, I like your positions, but I'm not so keen on teachers' unions. And in these quiet conversations on the phone, all of our lawmakers are getting influenced by these sort of sources of corporate power. So, lot to talk about, and I am so honored to be here. John Powell has had such an influence on me, and I've just loved the last couple days. And I gotta say, I know less about my other two panelists, although I'm excited to learn more. But Rashad, talking about taking on corporate power, has not only beat the cable industry, but just beat Bill O'Reilly. And I believe if Democrats are going to win, we cannot win without taking on corporate power. It's not just that it is our enemy, it is actually essential to bringing people together to realize our shared enemy is actually the big corporations, not each other.
Good morning, everybody. How y'all doing? So my name is Sabrina. I am at heart an organizer, and I'm super honored to be on this amazing panel. I've been organizing for about 20 years, and I started out as a student at UCLA back in the 1990s. And John Powell mentioned yesterday that at that time we had a Republican governor, and California was really the local laboratory for the right wing. Any kind of attack on everybody, they cooked it up, exported it, and we were on the defense. And when I was a student at UCLA, we were faced with skyrocketing fees. And in the midst of this, a regent, Ward Connerly, introduced an attack on affirmative action. And we did all the things. We protested, we took to the streets, we did civil disobedience, we wheat pasted inside administration buildings, we did delegations, we did postcards, and at the end of the day, we lost because we had no power. We had no power over this autonomous Board of Regents who voted to eliminate affirmative action in 1995. And then they took it to the ballot in 96. It passed in California, and they began exporting it throughout the nation. A few years later, well, actually just like a year later, I started working for a community-based organization called Agenda based in South Los Angeles. And I was introduced to a tool called the power analysis developed by Anthony Thigpen. And I learned a definition of power as the ability to achieve a collectively agreed upon goal. And that the problems of oppression and inequality were not just happenstance or accidental, but the result of a deliberate corporate agenda that sought to maximize profit, deregulate, extract, and change the role of government from protecting people to protecting capital through the buildup of the military and the police. And that only by understanding power, a sophisticated analysis of who has power, how they exercise power, and strategies for us to build power, could we change those conditions. The third thing I want to say about power is that in California, legitimate power is seen as positional power if you hold office, if you have money, if you are in an institution that has money and lobbyists and lawyers. And policy is shaped without us behind, in the Sacramento bubble, handshaking, backroom deals, and illegitimate power is seen as communities of color, immigrants, young people, both because we don't have power, but also because the right has been so effective at otherizing, right? Welfare queen, anchor babies, criminals. We have an attorney general who declares that he wants to eliminate filth, right, from the country. Those are his words. So California Calls were an alliance of local groups. We wanted to develop a strategy to build power, to build legitimate power as communities of color, low-income communities in a state as big and complex as California. And so we kicked the can down the road for several years and organized back in 2009 around a new strategy. There's 4 pieces to it. So one was, let's work beyond just one issue or campaign, but over the long term, around a strategic agenda, around multi-issues. At that time, California had seen a $20 billion budget, cuts just in 10 years. Teachers were getting laid off, the safety net was being decimated, our prisons were overcrowded. So how do we work together on a strategic agenda to address the consequences of those reactionary policies in the 90s? And the theory was that by building from the bottom up, investing in local grassroots groups, leadership, capacity, training, we could build power, both locally, but also statewide. Secondly, we wanted to change the electorate to reflect who lives in California. When 209 passed back in 1996, the electorate was 75% white. This past election, it was 56% white. That wasn't accidental. It was through organizing. It wasn't just us. It was alignment amongst the movement in California. But our piece is to focus on infrequent voters, folks who typically stay home on election day. We do phone calling. We go door to door. We build relationships over time. And we've seen increasing turnout amongst infrequent voters in California. The third piece is the story, right? We knew we had to change the story about government and taxes. And so we did research. We try to disrupt our thinking and our assumptions. We've worked with scholars. We're currently working with the Haas Institute. How do we create a new vision for government? How do we build a shared identity? And then the fourth piece is that we knew we couldn't do it alone. We had to build strategic alliances with labor, with other community-based networks in order to change the power in California. We started out small. So we were 8 groups in 4 counties. Our first program, we contacted 60,000 voters. Today, we have 30 organizations in 13 counties, and we have a supportive voter base of 715,000 people who are with us on the issues and turning out. Yay! In 3 years, we mobilized 500,000 voters and passed an initiative to tax the rich to fund schools. 2 years after that, we worked with Pico, California, and criminal justice groups to pass Prop 47 to start to roll back the 3 Strikes initiative. And then 2 years after that, we had a slew of progressive victories, both locally and statewide. And y'all know that the results here in California were a little different this past November. So the final thing I want to say is just about the moment that we're in. And I am in the Kumi School of Thought. Y'all have heard him a couple times. I think he said that we're screwed, his words. But Republicans and the right wing, they control every branch of federal government. They are 6 states away from calling a constitutional convention. They are intent on rolling back 80 years of progress of our movements that will inflict pain on our people. We've heard about the acceleration of climate change, the consequences of war. Our human existence is in peril. And we have white supremacists who are in power, and they have the agenda and the tools to deport, lock up, and murder people of color. So it's real, y'all. And two things. One, the resistance, there is hope, and we have to figure out how to channel that resistance to the local and state level, because that's where the path to power is. We don't have power at the federal level. And the second thing is, it's an all-hands-on-deck moment. We gotta figure this out together. We need scholars, we need organizers, we need the digital culture shakers, we need everybody to figure this stuff out, creative strategies, and to really build a new united front.
How are we doing? Good. It's great to be here. It's great to be with you all. I run an organization, ColorOfChange, and we were founded 11 years ago. Ow! With the express idea of building power. 11 years ago in the Gulf Coast, there was a flood that was caused by bad decision makers, Hurricane Katrina, that turned into a life-altering disaster by bad decision makers. And for many of us, we probably still remember those images of black people on their roofs begging for the government to do something, and they were left to die. Mm-hmm. And while it illustrated a whole lot of things that we know about issues like geographic segregation, generational poverty, the impacts of climate change, and an unjust criminal justice system, at the heart of it, no one was nervous about disappointing black people. And when institutions like media, corporations, and government are not nervous about disappointing your community, all sorts of things can happen. And so a single email was sent out to 1,000 people that said, Kanye was right after the telethon. We don't send out emails like that now because you never know where you're going to be in the news cycle. We also had T-shirts that I sometimes wear by mistake to the gym and have to explain myself. That said, we, using the technology of the time, channeling the energy of everyday people into moments, responding to the moments that are existing in the world and giving people something clear and strategic to do. I have a couple of slides, and one slide I want to bring up that really sort of shows our model. I'm not sure if that's possible. Or maybe it's not. That said, we have this model of respond. Are my slides?
I hope so.
We need the visual.
All right. Well, I'm gonna work without them. So we have this idea of respond, build, pivot, and scale. Responding to moments that exist in the world. So every single day there's something that's happening, and if you don't give somebody something clear to do, they will go back to doing what they were doing before. But if we don't, if we're just in respond mode, we're sort of in that mode of whack-a-mole, the kind of game that you play at the carnival where you try to hit something down, something else pops up, and you're not actually sort of doing the type of pivot that moves people's energy to actually changing the rules. And so at ColorOfChange, we have this idea of not mistaking presence for power. Presence is awareness, people paying attention to your issues, the retweets, the story in the New York Times. It is all the things, the symbolism of a black president or a pop celebrity that can stop the internet when she announces she's pregnant. All of those things are important. Presence is important, but far too often we mistake the presence for power. And power is the ability to change the rules. Sometimes the written rules of culture, sometimes the written rules of policy. So the unwritten rules and the written rules. All right, we're gonna go to the other slide. I'm sorry that this hasn't worked out as smoothly as I had hoped. All right. All right, I appreciate it. So the next slide. So I want to explain this really in terms of how you get to system change. So for the last several years at Color of Change, we've been responding to these moments where black people have been harmed or hurt by law enforcement and nothing was done. One moment was clearly the Anita Alvarez situation in Chicago. For years with partners, we had been responding to issues surrounding Anita Alvarez, the district attorney in Chicago. And I know there's some folks here from Chicago that have been doing amazing work on the ground in that regard for years.
Ow.
But the first time we responded was about 4.5 years ago when the Innocence Project called us because Anita Alvarez was ignoring DNA evidence that would have exonerated 10 black men who were convicted of a crime as juveniles and put behind bars. DNA evidence exonerated them. The police officer had moved up high inside of Cook County, and she decided that she didn't want to do anything about it. So we responded to that moment, mobilizing our members, making phone calls, showing up to rallies. We found out that President Obama was considering Anita Alvarez for a federal judgeship, which she wanted. We started running radio ads targeting President Obama. 5 days later, Anita Alvarez decided that the DNA evidence mattered and made the right decision. Sandra Bland was found hanging in a Waller County jail cell. It was part of a larger cultural movement that was led by women of color in our movement through Black Lives Matter, BYP 100, of really placing real specific energy on saying her name and saying the name of black women who were subject to violence from the state. The video of Sandra Bland's traffic stop went viral. Our organization jumped in. Hundreds of thousands of people signed the petition. We mobilized. In the process, we hired a private investigator to go down to Waller County to investigate what was happening. We found out collusion between the district attorney, the judge, the bail bonds, and collusion that, in fact, the people who were supposed to investigate the collusion were involved in the collusion. It's something interesting for any of my friends here in Texas. You probably know all about this. And in both of these situations, we were responding to individual moments, important moments that we were trying to solve, but are not rule changers. Even if we had won in every one of these moments, we're no stronger necessarily the next time around. And so we decided that we had to pivot. And over the course of the last year, we've really pivoted to two things: working on bail reform and working on district attorneys, electoralizing the work around district attorneys. And so moving our member energy to focus on district attorneys. There's 2,400 DAs around the country, 85% run unopposed, 90% are white, less than 1% are women of color. The incentive structures for who DAs think they listen to and who they pay attention to is completely off. So we decided to pick a couple of DA races and see if our members would engage, in electoral work. Over 3,000 members at Color of Change through our PAC participated in voter contact, doing over 1.5 million voter contacts this last election cycle, helping and working with local organizers on the ground to unseat 5 district attorneys out of the 7 that we engaged in. And in the process, changing the conversations that we're now having with district attorneys. Later this week, we'll release a report on the bail industry where we've been able to track the 18 major insurance companies that back about 80% of the local bail bonds industry. Insurance companies that have worked through the American Legislative Exchange Council, an organization that at Color of Change we have a deep and complicated relationship with. We show up on all their board minutes where they're tracking us. So we've tracked the relationship between the insurance companies and the bail bond industry. So never again will we show up to communities where local bail bonds will be able to show up and lobby to keep the bail industry the way it is and be able to say that they're just small businesses trying to do the job. Never again will the big insurance companies be able to create and write their own rules, many of these companies keeping most of their money offshore, and creating a system that has literally extracted the money and ruined black and brown families for decades in this country. The United States and Philippines are the only democracies in the world that have this type of money bail system. So all of that really is how we think about in a digital age of responding to the moments that exist in the world, how we build energy, then how do we move the energy of everyday people to the systemic pivots that actually change the rules? How do we force institutions and corporations to be nervous about disappointing Black people? And in the process, challenging and channeling the presence that Black people have in the world into the power to actually change the rules.
Thank you. So, are we progressives generally doing a good job right now of building power in this moment? I mean, this is a really unique moment. Obviously, we know what's at stake. We know what's on the line right now. It's a whole lot, but there's also a really unique opportunity right now. I mean, in my 20 years of organizing, I've never seen anything like it. I live in a small city, Lancaster, Pennsylvania. For the first 3 weeks after the election, I could not leave my house without somebody stopping me on the street, literally every time for 3 weeks, saying, what can I do? Yeah. How can I get involved? Please tell me what to do. One person said, I will work 20 hours a week instead of 40. If you can tell me something meaningful to do with that other 20 hours, I'll live on less. So there's this incredible moment of people wanting to get involved. How are we doing? My question is, how good of a job are progressive movements and organizations doing of turning that sentiment into political power? What are we doing well? What are some shining examples? What do we need to change? And what ways do we need to adapt? Whoever wants to take this first. Maybe you, Sabrina, if you...
I've thought a lot about this question, and I think that as social justice organizations, we got a lot of soul searching. I think that there's like exciting examples. We have there's a group of an alliance of groups in the Bay Area, Bay Rising. Right after the inauguration, they signed up 5,000 folks. They're channeling them into trainings, into action. But we have to do some soul searching in terms of the forms of organizations, how we engage people, how we sustain organizing and energy. Marshall Gantz mentioned yesterday, right? How do we take this moment and build it into a movement? And we got some old ways of thinking. You know, I think we have a lot to learn from the digital organizing world, right? How we engage in the arena of culture. After the inauguration, the Women's March, there was over 1 million people who marched here in California, 3/4 in Los Angeles. And so some of our staff went down, it was crowded, folks came back, and there was a lot of eye rolling about the really groovy signs that people were holding. But there's something there, right, in terms of how we tell our stories, the imagery, how we engage in the world of culture. So there's lots of potential, but I do think that it's going to require new thinking, new forms of organizations, new strategy, and where the energy comes is like when we work together, right, not just around a short-term fight, but can we think about how do we build the best, we take the best of boots on the ground organizing with digital organizing and combine those tools and innovate into something new. I think that's where the magic comes from, and that's where we need to get to.
I'll answer, thank you. I'll answer from the perspective of influencing the Democratic Party, because I believe, you know, there's this discussion the other day about should we have a multi-party system? You know, should we get rid of Citizens United? Yes, we should get rid of Citizens United, but we have Citizens United right now. It's not going away anytime soon. We have to live in that world, which means we all have to work 5 times as hard. I'm sorry. And we have a 2-party system, which means that progressives really have to engage in the Democratic Party. And I think it was Dr. Perry yesterday who was talking about this, engaging within the Democratic Party, because this is an institution that is deeply, deeply flawed. And I have as many problems with it as anybody else, but we got to engage within it. So I see the first 100 days then from the perspective of, let's look at the Democratic Party, what it's doing well, what it's not doing well, and then what we as progressives can do to try to influence that. On the one hand, the first 100 days have been incredible in terms of being able to stop a lot of the legislative work in Congress. Absolutely incredible, absolutely incredible. that basically Trump has not gotten anything done through the legislative arm. Executive arm, it's another problem. But there is an incredible temptation on the part of traditional corporate Democrats to erase themselves. So we've spent 30 years triangulating, which is basically a way of saying, don't look too hard, I don't really have progressive views, trying to get like a few Republican votes by being confusing about who you are. And what I worry about in this moment is that Democrats move to another form of self-erasure, which is they're just against Trump. And don't criticize ourselves because that gets us in the way of fighting Trump. But if we are just against Trump, we still don't exist.
Yep.
We still don't have a deep ideology.
Yep.
And so the two things that I think are the most important for progressives to push the party to do, and you can push it by becoming your county chair, by becoming your town chair, by getting involved locally, by spending time. I don't care if the people who you're working with are annoying you. This is power, and we have a responsibility to our country to engage in it. Is to do two things. One is the Democratic Party is not just about the presidency. It is about local, and I mean truly local power. And far too often, it just seems like whoever's the president, then they're just lots of little people representing that presidential candidate. And the second is that the Democratic Party has to aggressively take on corporate power, not just by saying we're economic populists. That doesn't cut it. You actually have to name names. If candidates are not willing to take on J.P. Morgan and Monsanto, they are not actually economic populists. So that be pressuring your local candidates to say, name the name of the corporations that are trying to control us. And I think that's the way that we as progressives can influence the party, and then we as a party can actually take on this soulless Republican Party.
So I think a couple of things. From the movement perspective, I think it's important that we understand the threat fully, and I feel like we're getting there. But right after the election, I was worried as folks started to talk about what they would do or how they would engage with the administration. Unlike President Obama, who was a change candidate, Donald Trump is a change the rules candidate. And changing the rules is much different in terms of sort of how our response has to be. Sort of the idea that judicial rulings are going to be implemented may not actually happen. That the way that we've understood policy to work, that I think hasn't always been right, but it's the way that they oftentimes understand it within democratic circles, may not actually happen that way. So we can't simply legal our way out of this, or policy our way out of this, or nonprofit executive direct our way out of this. It is movement building and narrative change that will be necessary. We may have disagreed with the politics of a previous housing and urban development secretary, but we knew they knew something about housing and urban development. That is what changing the rules sort of looks like. And so as a result, we've put together sort of this framework for how we think about what it means to have a true opposition strategy in this moment. Not simply just a resistance strategy, but an opposition strategy that's focused on taking back power. And so 3 different types of leadership sort of operate inside of this strategy. One is mediators, which I think 5% or less of us should be mediators in this context. And I think I'm being generous. Mediators try to work with the administration, find the points of opportunity, at least find the ways in which there may be things that where we're gonna lose, where we can make things better. The next is the 65% of us that should be fighters. Fighters hold the line. They don't give an inch. And in fact, they are really focused on holding enablers accountable, the cultural, media, corporate enablers that in fact have made Donald Trump possible, and their desertion and defections will make for him not to be possible anymore. And then the final 30% is something that we oftentimes don't do that well on the left. And the last 30% is winners. Winners, I don't mean winning an argument. I don't mean even winning election. I mean winning real-world victories for people at the local level, the victories that actually get implemented and enforced. So when we come back to people in 2 years or 4 years and we say that we want to lead, that it's not a rhetorical conversation about how we make their lives better because they like what we say or they like how we dress, but that we actually have a real conversation about how we've made their lives better, because there is a brand problem on the left. So this last election, Donald Trump was the big budget Hollywood movie. You know, the movie with all of the bombs and the plot twists, the empire is saved. You know, a lot of those things couldn't have actually happened, but you know, you don't want to have drinks with the person who dissects all of the plot twists afterwards. And on the left, it was the documentary. And I like documentaries. I do. I like documentaries. But the challenge with the genre of the documentary is that if one thing or two things don't line up, people throw out the whole documentary. And so to your point, if you are saying you stand up for the little guy, but you are being driven by Wall Street and Walmart, people throw out that documentary. So the documentary that says we're fighting for the little guy, and then at the end it says paid for by Walmart, it actually doesn't line up for people. And so it can't just be a movement of words, but it has to be a movement of action. So giving back the check to the polluter, or to the person who's the job discriminator, we have to do the things that show people where we actually stand, not just telling people where we stand. And that's how we build the type of opposition movement. That's how we build the type of powerful movement that people are going to want to get behind and stand behind.
So I'm going to weigh in on this one a little bit as well. I direct an organization called Beyond the Choir. That was a project for about 10 years, and now is an organization. And we started by looking at some of the insularity of the left and how we talk to ourselves and, you know, beyond the choir, not preaching to the choir. You know, so I was raised rural, conservative, religious in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. So I'm an unlikely suspect to be in this room, and I always wonder, like, people always ask me, like, how did you get involved? And I always think it's like a series of accidents, right? There's nothing very special about me. There were some opportunities. How do we present those opportunities to more people? So those are questions that have been weighing on me in this moment when so many people in Lancaster County, I moved back, who have never been involved, are clamoring to be involved. And there's still this kind of historic proportions, insularity of the left that I think we're still talking to ourselves. And there's this professionalization question too, right? Theta Scotch-Pole has talked about it, Robert Putnam has talked about it, that we've gotten used to doing a lot with staff. We've gotten used to campaigns that we're fully in control of. And this moment kind of calls for us reorienting ourselves to unleash an unwieldy force. And if I can brag for a minute about what we've been doing in Lancaster, there's a Lancaster, Pennsylvania, there is a Nation article that just came out today called, Is This Small City the Future of Democratic Engagement in America? And I hope so. But some of what we've done is we've applied some of the tools from my organization Beyond the Choir. We've identified a bunch of words that we don't use. We don't use the word activism. We hardly use the word protest. And we actually identified that there was a huge hunger for people who wanted to get involved, but things like protest and electoral work were unfamiliar terrains to them. And so we thought we needed to build up an opposition that had an electoral face, that has a protest face, but first we needed to create a civic face that people felt that they could identify with. So we started a town hall model. We called it Lancaster Stands Up, something very amorphous that people could see themselves as part of. And we have everything start with Lancaster values, right? Lancaster values welcoming our immigrant and refugee sisters and brothers. Lancaster values healthcare for all, and it's put our Representative Smucker, who is my second cousin once removed, it's put him on the defensive, you know? And some of what we've been playing with there is this model that is unwieldy, that we're not in control of, but is this civic face. And the last thing I want to say about it is we've been telling a story that weaves together some of these elements of how did we get here? And one thing we're doing, and it's got the local Democratic Party on edge, is we're unabashedly talking about how shitty the Democratic Party is. And that part of how we've gotten here is that the Democratic Party hasn't fought visibly for working people, and that we need to make them do that. And we've told a story about, thanks, and we've told a story about how money has rigged our political system, but part of how it was able to do so was, by attacking labor, but the decline of organized labor and the decline of civic involvement generally, of everyday people being involved in organizations that have the power to push back on the power of capital. And we've actually told this story to everyday people. About 2/3 of our people, we have 2,000 members we've built up since the election. About 2/3 of our people haven't been involved in anything before. And we thought maybe the story was too sophisticated. We've been doing canvassing the past couple weeks, and we thought maybe this is too complicated to train volunteers on, to go to working class neighborhoods and to say, hey, I don't like either party, but the Republican Party is a disaster. The Democratic Party, it's pretty bad. We're building independent political power. Want to join up and make the Democratic Party fight for us? We thought maybe that's going to be too complex. That's actually what's been opening doors. That's actually what's been getting people to register reluctantly as a Democrat in a closed primary state, because they see, they have the story of how everyday people like them can get involved. And even the last thing is getting involved at a low level. There's a repelling mechanism sometimes. Like, we all work full time, right? A lot of people in this room work full time, and sometimes that full-time commitment repels everyday people who might have 2 hours a week. So we've been telling a story about, if you've got 2 hours a week, that's great. Let's find the thing that you can do that adds capacity to this vehicle that's going to turn this thing around. Yeah. So I want to dig in a little bit more to some of the questions that have been emerging through this. We've skirted on it: electoral, the Democratic Party. What should our relationship be with the Democratic Party? Not just what should our relationship be in terms of insider outsider. Are there ways that we should be thinking about the Democratic Party that you could elaborate on?
This is you.
Well, I feel like I've already talked somewhat. I just want to sort of extend what you said, and really drawing on some of John Powell's work, is one of the important things that I think you're talking about is like really treating people as full people, first of all, and addressing anxiety. And that one of the most important things that I have learned from Powell that affected me in my own races, but I think is that instead of sort of hiding from anxiety, hiding from the thing that might be wrong with you or the thing that might be wrong with the party, you actually have to fully address it, and that isn't a form of betrayal. And this is a weird moment, and I certainly feel this sometimes. If I criticize, I criticized former President Barack Obama the other day for taking the $400,000, and I love President Obama. But the way that I got a lot of pushback on that. And the pushback was, how can we criticize ourselves given what we're facing with Trump? And there's not even a close equivalency between Trump or corporate power and what the president did. And I may be wrong in my criticism. I feel strongly about it, but I'm okay with being wrong. But we have to have some comfort with allowing these kinds of conversations at every level in our society if we are going to build community. Because if you don't address anxiety and you don't address fear, then people say, there's no room for me here because I'm supposed to be just, lockstep. And so I believe that and this is where we have to call on love and generosity and bring a lot of generosity into our debates, so that if we disagree, we can still be generous with each other in our disagreement and move forward. And then also, relatedly, I live in a rural district. It's a district that was almost 7% Obama and over 7% Trump. So I sort of was in the, in the middle of the wave. And I got to tell you that there's, I think, one thing we have to do, and when we talk about love, we have to take love very seriously, is love people who say bigoted things. love people who support candidates who we think are destroying America. Now that's hard, but that ultimately that love not only expands the beyond the choir, but even within the choir, because I actually can say in my community, I feel like a lot of Democrats feel uncomfortable sharing their own love with people that voted differently, and we gotta actually allow people to bring that kind of love into the conversation instead of saying, no, I won't even talk to those folks.
I want to keep this question in the air, but add to it with an additional question. What is the relationship of the street and the ballot in this moment? Should we be electoralizing the resistance?
Well, I think sometimes we can set up a false dichotomy that it's either we're in the streets or we're organizing electoral power, and we need it all, right? If we're really gonna be serious about taking back our country and taking down Trump. In terms of the relationship to the Democratic Party, there's been a lot of conversation, right? Is this the moment for a third party? And I think ultimately that's where we need to get to, but it's complicated, not to quote our president or number 45. It is complicated, and the path to get there, I don't know what that is, but our strategy has been to build an independent center of gravity, right? So can we build power, a new pole in the landscape that essentially breaks through the bubble and forces our elected officials, our institutions to move in a more progressive direction. I want to also offer one story, listening to Rashad and just the normalizing winning and us being the winners. When we first threw down our big fight around the Tax the Rich initiative, Prop 30, back in 2012, we started doing research back in 2011, and the conventional wisdom is that California would never go for a tax increase, right? We're staunchly anti-tax, it would never fly, it would never pass at the ballot. We worked with the California Federation of Teachers, a coalition of community groups, we did research, we did polling, we came up with an awesome initiative, the Millionaire's Tax. We filed it, and a week later, the governor came behind us and filed a competing initiative. Some of our institutional friends, our allies, actually jumped ship. They did their power equation, and then the governor did full court press to get us to stand down. And we held our ground. We knew we had a more compelling initiative. It was more progressive. It raised more money. We had grassroots folks who were excited. We had enough money to qualify. We had to collect 800,000 signatures. We couldn't take it to the ballot, but we held our ground. At the end of the day, the governor came to the table and agreed to a negotiated new, more progressive initiative. And we then ended up, Prop 30, right? And then we ran a parallel campaign, because typically campaigns focus on always voters. And so we focused on infrequent voters. We turned out 500,000 votes. That was 6% of the yes vote. It passed by 55%. So we were the secret sauce. So there's a few lessons. One, that power concedes nothing without a demand. Two, that we can have an outsized impact, right? And I do think that we need in the streets, we need the digital, we need it on the ground, we need the electoral, we need to be working together. We can have an outsized impact, and there was some smoke and mirrors going on. And then finally, we do normalize. We create a new normal when we win, right? So this past election, we passed 2 statewide tax initiatives. There were 100 local revenue measures. 80% of them passed. And we went blue in counties like Orange County, San Bernardino, San Diego, that are typically red. So by winning, we become the new normal.
I think a lot about those months after the Ferguson uprising as a sort of a real example of our relationship with the Democratic Party and our relationship with democratic structures and what actually needs to change. And so the sort of ebb and flow of support and resources for Black independent infrastructure on the ground in local communities, the decimation of Black independent power, the ebb and flow funding that has made it so that people are funded and supported around electing Democrats that they oftentimes don't choose,
Right.
and then are defunded once the elections are over,
Yep.
that you could have a Democratic governor in the state of Missouri that could only get elected with Black people's votes, refuse to appoint a special prosecutor, refuse to basically do anything. It is sort of the perfect example of having presence without power, and how we actually need to change our relationship with the Democratic Party and the corporate control that has taken over the party over the last several decades, that has made it so that our votes are present, but our voices are not.
No
And so the way I think that we have to continue to do this is that we have to be willing to disrupt. We have to be willing to disrupt inside of primaries.
Yes.
We have to be willing to disrupt inside of general elections, because that is the only way, and the Tea Party is a perfect example
Yep.
of the fact that, as you all have said, power concedes nothing without demand, without organizing, and without infrastructure. And so we are in this moment where many will tell us to sort of sit back and wait. It's really bad, and it is, that this is not the time to disrupt. But what we look like as a country and what we look like as a movement will depend on what we do now. And what we do now cannot be to turn over the sort of wheels of power to the corporate elites and those that have gotten us into this position in the first place. I have sat and went to a lot of panels over the last several months where the people who ran this past sort of election tell us what went wrong. They sort of break down the sort of paint-by-number polling of the polling that told them before the election that people wanted vegetables and then people chose French fries. And they're like, I can't believe people chose the French fries. They said they wanted the vegetables. And that's what we actually need to get away from. And so it does go back to action over words. It goes back to us being willing to disrupt. And it goes back to us building the type of independent infrastructure, the type of power that forces our leaders to come to us and not the other way around.
I just want to underline something that Rashad said that is so important, which is very practical and something everybody can do, which is primaries. That the Democratic, the corporate Dems have a lot of power right now, and they go around the country and they look for people who, they say they have these factors, but I got to tell you, the factors line up really well with what their corporate donors want. And even in my race, it's not much a secret, they tried to push me out of a primary, and then later they're like, oh, it turns out we like you because you can raise money. Not it turns out we like you for any other possible reason, but they are looking for people who they see can raise money. And just think about what that vision looks like and how easy that can be as a way to sort out people who are actually representing the people are. So first of all, there's so many things to say, but in primaries, organizing really, really matters, because in primaries, a small number of people vote. So it is an incredible opportunity, and anybody who tells you we can't have a primary because that's going to cause too much, this is part of what I was talking about before, disruption in the party. They are people who do not want to let go of power. That's just a rhetoric to say let's not let go of power. So if we can, instead of having this year be a year where we all sort of fakely come together, let's have this year be a year where we redefine the Democratic Party by running in primaries and having anti-corporate candidates everywhere in this country.
So we have time for one more question with probably pretty brief responses from everyone. Rashad, I actually want to know if you might want to kick this one off. So there's different levels of political alignment for power, right? There's alignment on an issue that groups or movements emerge in relationship to the issue or the specific constituency. And then there's broader popular issues, so like economic populism we think about. So this kind of tension between the particular and the popular. What can we do, or what are you doing in your organizing work to advance popular opposition goals while also centering the particular needs and concerns of particular communities?
Great, that's a great question, and a great question to end on. And so a couple of things in terms of how we are thinking about sort of both issues and how we are thinking about the sort of larger vision. First is really having sort of a clear understanding, and I think about this a lot in terms of how do we tell the story of them, of the sort of, what I like to think of as like the takers, the corporate folks, the sort of story that Bernie Sanders was telling, that economic populist story, with the story that President Obama told, which was the story of us, the sort of multiracial America, the Bernie story of them and the Obama story of us. And how do we tell that story while centering the particular needs of what people care about? And so we've done that through trying to electoralize movement moments. So I showed that slide earlier around district attorneys, really sort of talking much bigger around the criminal justice system, but giving people very clear things they can do in their elections, moving from issues to the election, and doing that around a couple of other key issues. Because oftentimes we are focusing simply on the issues and not the structures. Not the structures that got us here. And so there's two structures that I just want to end by talking about that are structural issues that will determine how powerful we are moving forward and what we will be able to accomplish on any of the other things that we care about. One is voting rights. It's an issue that oftentimes doesn't get as much play and attention that it should, but we cannot win if we cannot vote. And our opposition knows that they cannot win if we can vote. Yep. And so they have spent time, money, and energy putting up barriers to the polls in places around this country and preventing us from being able to express our will for a better future. And if we don't actually deal with that with the same passion, energy, and engagement as we deal with all the other issues, then it will be for naught. The movements that we build will build for naught. And the next is our ability to share information and be powerful in this sort of new digital age. And that is the sort of wonky issue that oftentimes is again talked about, which is net neutrality. And it is our ability to be heard and counted. The internet, the big telecom companies, AT&T, Sprint, Verizon, they want to be able to treat the internet like they are editors of a newspaper. In fact, they've argued that in the courts, basically determining what gets put on the front page and what gets put on the back page. And they are right now working to undo the laws that President Obama pushed along with the FCC that will basically make there fast lanes and slow lanes on the internet. So this is an issue from everything from our ability to be able to be heard, whether you are a Black Lives Matter activist, a dreamer, an LGBT mom starting a blog, whoever you are, and you want to be heard in powerful ways in this new world, the internet is oftentimes a place, and they are trying to take that away from us. So I just think in terms of all of that is thinking about the structures by which we are able to make our voices heard, protecting those and advancing those will give us the ability to make our organizing as real and as powerful as possible. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
A couple thoughts. So one is, in our experience, when we have concrete issues that impact people's lives, that's how we've been able to inspire folks to turn out and vote, right? Prop 30 brought funding into schools. Prop 47 had real impact on people's lives to undo the mass incarceration in California. So we need concrete, specific issues, but we also need a bigger, broader vision, right? And an alternative value that can push against the dominant worldview that's being pushed out by Trump and his administration. And our assumptions, right, like we often write our messaging and our narrative based on logic, based on facts. We talk about issues. We assume people care about issues like we do. And in fact, folks care about family, their jobs, their neighborhoods, right? So there is definitely something in how we tell our stories. What is the narrative? How do we build a sense of identity and belonging that's broader than just our small community-based organizations or the circle of us activists, right? The insular preaching to the choir. We have to figure out a strategy to build our version of the Tea Party, right? Like a cooler, progressive, radical challenge of corporate power, of status quo, of racism, right? A sense of belonging. And so I think that is a need and a key challenge. And then the final thing is that we have to build, just to underscore the point, we have to build infrastructure at the bottom up. It doesn't take a lot. It doesn't take a ton of money, right? But investing in the long term. The invading army approach doesn't work. Just working in elections doesn't work. We have to build local capacity, local leaders, lasting infrastructure if we're going to build power.
So I agree with everything that's been said, except in the short term, I think we're going to be in a two-party system, and we've got to work within that. And I am a big fan of fusion voting, which we have in New York State, which allows for the Working Families Party to exist, but also have power within the Democratic Party. But I think one of the most important things, and this relates to both Masha Gessen and John Powell, is we have to tell the truth about power in a way that people recognize themselves and recognize their own experience in the world. And so I actually believe one of the critical steps is being honest about the state of power that makes sense to people. I went to a lot of Tea Party events in 2008, 2009. I'm an organizer. I want to figure out what was going on. And then I went to events with Democratic Party leaders, and people would say, I feel out of power. And the Tea Party people would say, you're right, you're out of power because government has taken it away from you. And too many Democratic leaders would say, you are wrong, you are not out of power. Your experience is false. And so I think part of our job here is to tell a true story about power. So Rashad was talking about net neutrality, but that is just one instance of these new data monopolists that really have incredible power over our lives. So I want to talk about power with Walmart. Walmart can tell, and New York Times reported this, Coca-Cola what sweetener to use in its recipes because Coca-Cola wants access to shelf space at Walmart. Okay. That means that Amazon can tell publishers what sweeteners to use in its books because publishers want access to Amazon's shelf space. Am I making sense here? Comcast or the big cable companies can tell MSNBC and the cable shows what language to use on their shows, and they don't even have to say it directly because those shows want to stay on the air. And so that if you want to be on the air, you want to be sure that you're not talking about opposing the Comcast MSNBC or NBC merger, right? So we have these companies that are like these, they're more powerful than the railroads of the Gilded Age, that are controlling our ideas, that are controlling our workers, that are anti-union, anti-worker, and they're playing these massive roles in our society. And we have to sort of recognize and acknowledge the governing and powerful role that they are playing right now. Because I'll tell you, when I'm on the campaign trail, whoever you're talking to, people know this. They know that there's something wrong when these cable companies and the big telecoms have power. Now, so far they've been kind of benevolent. But as Tim Wu says, to believe in Google, you have to be a bit of a monarchist. I'm not comfortable with giving these big companies that much power because they're not going to stay benevolent. And if you think that Google's benevolent, until groups like ColorOfChange and others got involved, they were funding ALEC, which was funding the voter suppression efforts in North Carolina. Right? So there is corporate power leveraging racial anxiety because they want lower tax rates. And if we aren't honest about how that power system is working, I don't actually think we're going to connect. And the difference between Democrats and Republicans is Republicans can win if words don't make sense. Because deep down they are pushing a nihilistic story of isolation. You're all on your own. Truth doesn't exist. Nothing matters. Government can't do anything. So it doesn't matter if they lie. It doesn't matter if they're inconsistent. Lying and inconsistency are part of the destruction of the community that comes together with truth. And we actually have to rely on truth, and we have to rely on truth about power, otherwise we're never going to win.
So, as we all know here very well, the stakes are very high. But one of the opportunities I think we have in this particular piece is that Trump represents some of the worst aspects of capitalism, racism, xenophobia, misogyny, all in one comic clown character who is the president. And what happens in this moment is that any one of our particular struggles has the potential to stand in as the popular uniting symbol. So the first big fight in the new administration was over the fate of one of the most vulnerable populations in our country. So the anti-Muslim ban, right, became the popular symbol uniting a broad opposition. And we have this moment where that's kind of what we call the pedagogy of a campaign, where we can be expanding the analysis over time of the population. We can be uniting forces, breaking out of the silos that we're often trapped in. And we have this opportunity to tell this story of this broad we, right? Where we can't tell necessarily. Trump was very good at this we. You couldn't tell if he was talking about his campaign, who was in the room, or America. He actually does it masterfully.
Yeah.
We can do something similar where you can't tell if we're talking about the left, the opposition, or society itself. We have this opportunity to tell a popular we story. And I think we often end up, over the past 40 years, solving the kind of deep crisis of community that we have in America only for ourselves in the left and develop a clubhouse mentality. We have the opportunity to break out of that right now and to tell a real story that can align new forces and build the power that we need to turn this around. I want to thank all of my fellow panelists here for being part of this conversation. And we're at time.
Thank you.